They told her berserkers were extinct, and Senator Lyra Valen believed them. Right up until the rain started hitting the armored glass like needles, and her driver didn't blink as the city lights smeared into long neon scars across the windshield. The engine humming steady at 50 miles per hour, while traffic control channels filled with static and distant alerts she wasn't supposed to hear. Her blue fingers pausing over the datapad as a classified file flickered on screen, grainy footage of a human moving too fast, labeled simply B-13. Then it vanished, access denied. And she looked up to find Ethan Cole already watching the rearview mirror, not tense, not afraid, just waiting, as if the world had already made its move and he was counting the seconds until it arrived. "Is something wrong, driver?" she asked, her voice calm, practiced, political, and he met her eyes for half a heartbeat before returning to the road. "Road's about to get busy, ma'am," he said, quiet, almost polite, like he was commenting on the weather. And that was when the convoy shifted formation without command, escorts tightening, signals dropping, the air itself feeling heavier, like a storm pressing down on steel and glass, and Lyra felt it then. Not danger, not exactly, but a pattern breaking, something out of place. In a system she understood too well, she opened another channel, tried to reach security command, but the line died in her ear with a soft click that sounded far too final, and outside the city seemed to hold its breath, pedestrians frozen mid-step, drones hovering just a little too still, and Ethan slowed the vehicle by exactly 5 miles per hour, no more, no less, adjusting course by inches, precise, deliberate, as if following instructions no one else could hear. "You're deviating from protocol," she said, sharper now, and he nodded once, almost apologetic. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, and didn't correct it, didn't explain, just kept driving into a silence that felt engineered, and Lyra realized with a cold clarity that whatever was about to happen had already accounted for her, her guards, her authority, everything except the man behind the wheel, because there was no record of him beyond a simple employment file, no military history, no commendations, no reason for the way his hands rested on the controls like they belonged there more than anywhere else, like he had spent years gripping something heavier, faster, more dangerous. And for the first time since entering office, Senator Lyra Valen felt a question she couldn't answer forming in her mind, not about the threat outside, but about the human inside the car with her, the one who drove like he was remembering. Something the rest of the galaxy had chosen to forget, and as the rain intensified and the first distant flash lit up the horizon, she understood one thing with absolute certainty. Ethan Cole was not reacting to the situation, he was recognizing it. The flash on the horizon did not fade. It multiplied, scattering across the skyline like reflections in broken glass, and every signal inside the vehicle went silent at once. No alerts, no commands. Just the low hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of rain striking reinforced metal as Ethan adjusted his grip by a fraction of an inch, eyes tracking something Lyra could not yet see. "Stay seated," he said, still calm, still measured, and it was not a suggestion, it was a calculation already made, and she felt it, the shift from driver to something else, something that did not require her authority to act. "Explain," she demanded. But the word carried less force than she intended, because the world outside had begun to move in ways that did not follow any known protocol. Vehicles ahead slowing without reason, drones drifting off their assigned paths, lights flickering in patterns that felt almost intentional, and Ethan guided their car through it with quiet precision, never braking too hard, never accelerating too fast, like he was threading a path through a maze only he could see. "We are being isolated," Lyra said, more to herself than to him, her mind assembling fragments, communications blackout, escort disruption, environmental manipulation, but the pieces did not fit any known strategy, not unless the objective was not her, and that thought settled in with a weight she could not ignore. "They are not targeting me," she said slowly, and for the first time Ethan's expression changed, not fear, not surprise, just confirmation. "No, ma'am," he replied, and the simplicity of it sent a colder chill through her than any weapon could have, because it meant everything she understood about this moment was already obsolete. The convoy ahead vanished around a corner that should not have existed on the route map. The navigation system flickered, then reset. And Ethan did not look at it once, not even a glance, as if he had memorized a version of the city that no longer matched reality. Who are they targeting? Lyra asked, her voice lower now, controlled, and Ethan did not answer immediately. His gaze fixed forward, watching the rain distort the world into shifting shapes and blurred motion. Someone they think is still here, he said at last, and that was not an answer. It was a warning wrapped in restraint. Lyra studied him then, really studied him. The way his breathing remained steady despite the tension in the air. The way his posture did not change even as the environment around them unraveled. And she realized something that unsettled her more than the silence. He was not reacting to the threat. He was adapting to it in real time, like a system reactivating after long dormancy. And the datapad on her lap flickered again, just for a second. The locked file reappearing with a single line visible before it vanished once more. Status: unresolved. And she looked up sharply. But Ethan had already slowed the vehicle again, exactly 3 miles per hour this time, aligning them with an empty stretch of road that should have been crowded at this hour. "Why are you slowing down?" she asked, and he exhaled quietly, not tired, not afraid, just preparing. "Because," he said, his voice softer now, almost distant, "this is where they expect me to run." And he did not accelerate, did not turn away. He kept driving straight into the quiet, into the center of something designed with him in mind. And Lyra felt the last piece fall into place, not about the attackers, not about the plan, but about the man beside her, because no ordinary human would recognize a trap this precise, and no ordinary driver would choose to enter it on purpose. The rain thinned into a fine metallic mist as the city block ahead emptied with unnatural precision, storefront lights dimming one by one until the street became a corridor of muted reflections and distant echoes. And Ethan guided the vehicle to a controlled stop at exactly 20 feet from an intersection that should have been active, his foot easing off the accelerator like he had arrived at a destination only he recognized. "This is far enough," he said quietly, and Lyra felt the weight of that statement settle in the cabin. Not fear, not panic, but inevitability, like a door closing somewhere she could not see. "You brought us into it," she said, her voice steady but edged with something sharper now. And Ethan gave a small nod, eyes still forward. "If I did not, they would keep moving the board until they got what they wanted," he replied, and the way he said it made it sound less like strategy and more like memory. Like he had seen this pattern before, lived through it, maybe, more than once. The engine idled with a low vibration that filled the silence. And for a moment nothing happened, no movement, no signal, just the quiet pressure of a situation waiting to reveal itself. Then the first sign appeared, not with noise, but with absence. The rain stopped mid-fall along the edge of the intersection, droplets suspended in a thin line like an invisible wall had been drawn across the street. Lyra leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as her mind raced to identify the technology, a localized field, a containment perimeter, something designed to isolate without destruction. "They are sealing the area," she said, and Ethan finally turned his head, just enough to acknowledge her. "Yes, ma'am," he answered, and there was no urgency in his tone, only acceptance, as if this was the moment he had been counting toward since the first drop of rain touched the windshield. "Then we leave," she said, reaching for the control panel. But his hand moved first, not fast, not forceful, just enough to rest over the interface and stop her without resistance. "We cannot," he said, and for the first time there was something beneath his calm, not fear, not doubt, but restraint, like he was holding something back with deliberate effort. "They are not here for you," he continued, and the clarity of it made her pause, truly pause, because every instinct told her to assert control, to command, to override. But something in his voice made those instincts feel misplaced, like using the wrong tool for the wrong problem. Outside, the suspended rain line shimmered faintly, revealing silhouettes at the edge of perception, not fully visible, not fully hidden, shapes that moved with coordinated patience. And Lyra felt a realization form, slow and undeniable. This was not an attack. It was a retrieval. "They are waiting," she said, more softly now, and Ethan's gaze returned to the front, his reflection faint in the glass. "Yes," he replied, and his next words came with a quiet finality that changed everything she thought she understood about him. They have been waiting a long time. The cabin seemed smaller then, the air heavier, not from the threat outside, but from the truth settling inside it. Lyra studied him again, not as a driver, not as an employee, but as a variable she had failed to account for. And she noticed the smallest detail, his hands, still on the wheel, not gripping, not tense, just steady, like a man who had already made his decision long before this moment arrived. "Ethan," she said, his name deliberate now, and he met her eyes fully for the first time since the rain began, calm, present, and impossibly distant all at once. "Who are you?" she asked, and the question hung between them as the boundary outside solidified, the world narrowing to a single point of confrontation. And Ethan did not answer right away. He looked back to the road, to the place where the rain had stopped and the silhouettes waited. And when he finally spoke, it was not an explanation, not a title, just a quiet truth shaped like a warning. "Someone they were not supposed to find," he said, and as the suspended droplets began to fall again, breaking the stillness, Lyra understood that whatever was about to happen next was not about politics, not about power, but about something far older, something the galaxy had tried to erase and somehow failed. The droplets finished falling like a curtain being lowered and the street exhaled, sound returning in layers, the distant hum of power lines, the soft hiss of cooling metal, the faint click of something unseen aligning into place. And Ethan shifted the gear into park with a deliberate motion that carried more meaning than the action itself, his hand lingering on the control for a fraction of a second before releasing it, as if marking the end of one role and the beginning of another. "You will stay inside the vehicle," he said, not looking at Lyra yet, and there was no command in his tone, only certainty, the kind that did not require obedience to function. Lyra did not respond immediately, her mind moving faster now, mapping possibilities, recalculating priorities, but every path led back to the same conclusion. This situation was no longer within the boundaries of her authority, and that realization did not weaken her, it sharpened her. "You said they are not here for me," she replied, her voice controlled. "Then I am not your liability." And Ethan's eyes flickered toward her, a brief acknowledgement of the logic, but not acceptance. "You are my responsibility," he said, and the distinction landed heavier than she expected, because it was not about rank, not about protocol, it was about choice, and that made it far more dangerous. Outside, the silhouettes at the edge of the street began to take clearer form, not stepping forward, not advancing, just existing with a patience that felt rehearsed, like actors waiting for a cue that only one person could give. Lyra watched them through the glass, noting the uniform spacing, the synchronized stillness, the absence of any visible weaponry, and that absence was more telling than any display of force. "They expect you to come out," she said, and Ethan gave a small nod, reaching up to the collar of his jacket, adjusting it with a simple, almost habitual gesture that felt out of place in the tension of the moment. "Yes," he answered, and there was no hesitation in it, no resistance, just acknowledgement of a role he had not chosen, but would not avoid. The cabin felt quieter now, not empty, but focused, like the space between two breaths, and Lyra realized she had one question left that mattered, not as a senator, not as a strategist, but as someone standing at the edge of something larger than policy. "If you step out there," she said, her voice softer now, stripped of its usual authority, "do you come back?" And Ethan paused, truly paused, his hand resting on the door handle without moving, the question settling into him in a way nothing else had, and for the first time since this began, the answer was not immediate, not certain. He looked at his reflection in the side window, rain tracing faint lines across the glass, distorting the image just enough to make it feel like someone else, someone he had been, or someone he was trying not to be again. "I will try," he said finally, and it was not a promise. It was the most honest thing he could give. Lyra studied him in silence, then reached forward, not to stop him, not to command him, but to place her hand lightly against the console, grounding herself in the reality of the moment. "Then I will be here," she replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any order she could have given. Ethan nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that seemed to settle something unspoken between them, and then he opened the door, the outside air slipping into the cabin with a cool, damp breath. carrying with it the faint scent of ozone and something older, harder to name. He stepped out onto the wet pavement, closing the door behind him with a soft, controlled click, and as he moved forward, the silhouettes across the street shifted in unison, not advancing, not retreating, but recognizing, as if the moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. And inside the vehicle, Lyra remained still, watching through the glass as the man she thought she understood walked into a space designed for him, and only him. And for the first time, she did not see a driver leaving his post. She saw something stepping back into a role the galaxy had tried to erase and failed. The rain resumed its steady rhythm against the pavement as Ethan stepped forward, each footfall measured, unhurried, closing the distance between himself and the figures waiting across the intersection, his jacket darkening with moisture, his silhouette sharpening under the dim streetlights. And still he did not rush, did not prepare. He simply walked as if answering a call that had been waiting for him long before this night began. The air carried a low-frequency hum now, subtle but constant, like a system waking up, and the shapes ahead resolved into defined forms. Tall, precise, their presence controlled and deliberate, not aggressive, not uncertain, just focused entirely on him, and only him. Identification confirmed. A voice said, not loud, not directed, but present in the space itself, as if spoken by the environment rather than a single source. Ethan stopped 10 feet short of the invisible boundary, his hands at his sides, posture relaxed, but his stillness held a kind of weight that pressed against the silence. You took your time, he replied, his voice even, carrying no strain, no surprise, just a quiet acknowledgement of a conversation that had been paused for years, perhaps decades. The figures did not move closer, but the air between them shifted, a faint distortion like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. Directive remained active. The voice continued. Subject B13 designated unresolved, and the words settled into the space with clinical precision. But something beneath them felt patient, like the system speaking had learned to wait. Inside the vehicle, Lyra leaned forward, slightly, her eyes tracking every detail, every nuance of tone and movement, her mind parsing the exchange, not as a negotiation, not as an encounter, but as a retrieval protocol unfolding in real time. And yet there was something wrong with it, something incomplete, because the target was not resisting, not evading, he was engaging, willingly, and that was not how retrievals were supposed to function. You could have stayed gone, the voice said, and for the first time there was a shift, not emotion, but deviation, like a pattern encountering an unexpected variable. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cool air, his gaze steady on the forms ahead. I did, he answered, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any denial could have, because it was true, not just an action, but an intent. He had chosen to leave whatever designation they had given him behind, to become something else, someone else, and the system in front of him had not accounted for that kind of change. Designation does not expire, the voice replied, returning to its structured cadence. Function remains. And that was the core of it, not a threat, not a demand, but an assumption that he was still what they had made him, that he would respond as he had been designed to respond. Ethan tilted his head slightly, rain tracing along his jawline, his expression calm, almost reflective. That depends, he said, and the pause that followed was not empty. It was charged, like the moment before a decision takes shape. On what? The voice asked, and there it was again, deviation, curiosity threading through protocol. A question not strictly necessary for execution, and Ethan's gaze flickered, just for a fraction of a second, toward the vehicle behind him, toward the place where Lyra waited, not as a senator, not as a target, but as a witness to what he would choose next. On whether I am still yours, he said, and the words did not echo, did not linger. They simply existed, undeniable, and for the first time since he stepped into the intersection, the figures across from him shifted, not forward, not back, but enough to break their perfect symmetry, and inside the vehicle Lyra felt it. The precise moment the situation stopped being a controlled retrieval and became something far more unpredictable, because whatever Ethan Cole had been before this night, he was now making a choice that no system had written for him. The air between Ethan and the figures seemed to tighten, not physically, but conceptually, like a system recalibrating around an unexpected input. And for a moment nothing moved, nothing advanced, yet everything felt closer, more focused, as if the entire street had narrowed into a single line drawn between him and them. Ownership is not a variable, the voice stated, returning to its structured cadence. But the slight delay before the words revealed. Something had shifted beneath the surface. Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze steady, posture unchanged, rain continuing to trace quiet lines down his jacket. But inside, something was aligning, not awakening, not unleashing, just settling into place, like a weight rediscovered. "It is to me," he said at last, and the simplicity of it carried a different kind of force, not opposition, not defiance, but definition. He was not arguing their logic. He was replacing it, inside the vehicle. Lyra felt the significance of that moment more than she understood it, her fingers resting lightly against the console, her breathing controlled, but her thoughts moving faster than they ever had in any chamber or negotiation, because this was not policy, this was identity, and identity did not bend easily. Outside, the silhouettes adjusted again, their alignment no longer perfect, their spacing altered by inches, subtle but undeniable. Deviation acknowledged, the voice said, and now the tone carried something new, not emotion, but adaptation, like a system rewriting its parameters in real time. "Clarify status." It continued, and the request itself was a fracture in its own structure, because clarification implied uncertainty, and uncertainty had not existed here moments before. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the smallest movement, but deliberate, grounding, as if reminding himself of the surface beneath his feet, the reality he had chosen. "Status is simple," he said, his voice steady, unraised, but fully present. "I am not returning." The words settled into the space with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not forceful, just complete, and for a fraction of a second the entire environment seemed to pause again, not from external control, but from internal recalculation. Lyra watched closely, her eyes tracking every reaction, every micro-adjustment, because she could feel it now. The moment where control was no longer theirs, where the outcome was no longer predetermined. "Directive remains," the voice replied, but this time the repetition lacked certainty, like a statement trying to hold its own weight without the structure beneath it. "Then update it," Ethan said. And that was something entirely different, not refusal, not resistance, but instruction, and that shift in dynamic changed the entire interaction, because he was no longer positioned as the subject of the directive, he was standing outside of it, addressing it as something separate from himself, something that could change, something that could be rewritten. The figures across from him did not advance, but their form seemed less rigid now, less absolute, like the edges of their presence had softened under pressure. "Update requires authorization," the voice said, and there it was again, the system reaching for a rule to stabilize itself, to reassert control. Ethan's gaze flickered once more toward the vehicle behind him, toward Lyra, not seeking approval, not asking permission, but acknowledging the reason he had chosen this path. And when he looked back, the decision was already complete. "Then consider this my authorization," he said, and the statement should have meant nothing to the system, should have been dismissed as irrelevant. But it was not, because something in his tone, in his presence, in the way he stood without hesitation or doubt, carried a weight the system could not easily categorize. And inside the vehicle Lyra felt it too, the quiet gravity of that moment, the realization that whatever Ethan had been created to be, he had become something else entirely, something that did not fit into any directive, any classification, any control. And as the rain continued to fall and the street held its breath once more, the system in front of him faced something it had not been designed to handle, not a weapon, not a threat, but a choice, and choices were far more difficult to contain. The silence stretched longer this time, not empty but dense, like the moment just before a storm decides where to break, and Ethan stood unmoving in the center of it, rain tracing steady lines across his shoulders, his presence anchoring the space in a way the system could not easily override. "Authorization not recognized," the voice said at last, but the words lacked the sharp certainty they carried before, as if the structure behind them had begun to question its own foundation. Ethan did not argue, did not repeat himself. He simply remained where he was, steady, patient. And that patience carried a quiet pressure of its own, because it forced the system to respond, not react. Inside the vehicle, Lyra felt her heartbeat settle into a slower rhythm, not from calm, but from clarity, because she could see it now, the shift in control. The way the exchange had moved from command to negotiation, from retrieval to something far more uncertain, defined new. Directive. The voice continued. And this time the deviation was undeniable. It was asking, not asserting, seeking structure where it had once imposed it. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, like he was choosing each word before it existed. You leave, he said, and the simplicity of it carried no room for interpretation, not a demand, not a threat, just a statement of what would happen next. The figures across from him did not move, but the air around them shifted again, a faint ripple passing through their formation, as if the command had introduced a variable they had not prepared for. Non-compliant outcome. The voice replied, but the delay before the response stretched longer than before, like the system was searching for a path that no longer aligned with its parameters. Ethan tilted his head slightly, rain catching the edge of his profile. Then find a compliant one, he said. And there was no resistance in his tone, no challenge, just an expectation that adaptation was possible. That change was not only necessary, but inevitable. Inside the vehicle, Lyra leaned forward a fraction more, her gaze fixed on him, because she understood now what the system was struggling to process. Ethan was not resisting it. He was outgrowing it, stepping beyond the boundaries it had defined and forcing it to follow. And systems were not designed to follow. They were designed to control. Subject exhibits divergence beyond acceptable thresholds, the voice stated. But the phrasing felt different now, less like a conclusion and more like an observation. And that difference mattered, because it meant the system was no longer certain of its own definitions. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, grounding himself again, his presence steady, unwavering. Then update your thresholds, he said, and the statement carried a quiet finality that echoed deeper than any raised voice could have, because it was not about this moment. It was about every moment that had led to it, every decision he had made to become something other than what they had intended. The figures across the intersection adjusted again, their symmetry breaking further, their alignment no longer absolute. And for the first time, one of them stepped forward by a single inch, not an advance, not a threat, but a test, a response to the new conditions. Ethan did not move to meet it, did not step back. He simply remained. And that stillness answered the test more clearly than any action could have. Inside the vehicle, Lyra felt the shift complete. The precise instant the situation crossed a threshold that could not be reversed, because whatever authority the system had held was now conditional, dependent on its ability to adapt, and Ethan was not giving it that option. He was defining the outcome himself. Processing, the voice said, and the word lingered longer than it should have, stretching into the space like a system searching for stability in a structure that no longer held. And as the rain continued to fall, and the street remained suspended between past directive and present choice, Lyra understood something with absolute clarity. This was no longer about whether Ethan would return. It was about whether the system could accept that he already had not, and the answer to that question was still unfolding in the silence between them. The word processing did not resolve. It lingered, stretched across seconds that felt longer than they should have. And the air between Ethan and the figures seemed to hold that delay like a fragile structure on the edge of collapse. The rain continuing its steady fall, each drop now audible again, grounding the moment in something real, while the system searched for something it no longer fully understood. Ethan did not move, his posture unchanged, his presence constant, and that constancy became its own kind of force, something the system could not categorize or override. Reclassification required, the voice finally said, and this time the tone had shifted beyond recognition, no longer rigid, no longer absolute, but adaptive, uncertain in a way that systems were never meant to be. Inside the vehicle, Lyra felt a subtle release in the pressure around them. Not safety, not resolution, but a transition, like a structure being dismantled piece by piece from within. Define new parameters. The voice continued, and the request carried a weight it had not before, because now it was not commanding, it was asking for direction. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, his gaze never leaving the figures in front of him. "You disengage," he said, and the simplicity of it returned, not expanded, not justified, just clear, because clarity was the only thing that mattered now. The figures across from him shifted again, more noticeably this time, their forms losing the perfect synchronization they had maintained, each one adjusting by small, independent increments, as if the collective was beginning to fragment into individual responses, disengagement conflicts with original directive. The voice replied, but the statement lacked resistance. It sounded like a fact being evaluated rather than a rule being enforced. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the conflict without concern. "Then the directive is wrong," he said, and there was no challenge in it, no defiance, just a quiet correction, and that correction carried more weight than any argument could have, because it did not attack the system, it redefined its foundation. Inside the vehicle, Lyra felt the significance of that shift settle into her understanding, because she realized this was not about defeating the system, it was about teaching it something it had never been designed to learn, that not all functions remained fixed, that not all outcomes were predetermined, that choice could exist outside of design. Processing updated conditions, the voice said, and the delay that followed was different now, not strained, not searching, but recalibrating, like a system finding a new balance point after losing its original center. The figures across the intersection began to fade slightly at the edges, not disappearing, but withdrawing from their previous state of certainty, their presence becoming less rigid, more transitional, and Ethan remained still, watching, waiting, not pushing, not forcing, because he understood that this part could not be rushed, that the system had to reach its own conclusion, had to arrive at the outcome in a way it could accept. Directive revised, the voice said at last, and the words carried a quiet finality that echoed differently than before, not imposed, but chosen. Subject B13 reclassified as independent entity. And that single change altered everything, not just the situation, but the meaning behind it, because it was no longer about control, it was about recognition. Inside the vehicle, Lyra felt a slow breath leave her chest, not relief, but understanding, because she knew what that meant, not just for Ethan, but for everything that had led to this moment. Engagement terminated. The voice continued, and the figures across the street began to withdraw, their forms dissolving back into the rain and the dim light, not retreating in defeat, but stepping away from a role they no longer held. And as the street returned to its quiet, ordinary rhythm, Ethan stood for a moment longer, ensuring the transition was complete, ensuring the system had truly disengaged, and only then did he turn back toward the vehicle, his expression unchanged, his steps measured, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. And inside the car, Lyra watched him approach, not as a driver returning to his seat, but as something else entirely, something that had just redefined itself in a way the galaxy had not expected. And as he reached for the door handle, the rain soft against the metal, the silence between them carried a new meaning, one that neither of them needed to speak aloud, because it had already been decided in the space between command and choice. The door opened with a soft, controlled click, and Ethan slipped back into the driver's seat, as if returning from something routine, something expected, the rain following him in faint droplets across the frame of the vehicle before the seal. Engaged, and the outside world muted once more into a distant hum, and for a moment neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because anything spoken would feel smaller than what had just happened. Lyra watched him carefully, not searching for signs of strain or injury, but for change, something that would confirm what she had witnessed was real. And yet he looked the same, posture steady, breathing even, hands resting lightly on the wheel like they had at the beginning of the night. "Are they gone?" she asked finally, her voice quieter now, not out of fear, but respect for the silence that still lingered between them. Ethan adjusted the mirror by a fraction of an inch, checking the empty street behind them where the silhouettes had stood moments before, and nodded once. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And the simplicity of the answer carried a kind of finality that closed the moment without needing explanation. The engine remained idle for a second longer, then he shifted the gear and eased the vehicle forward, the tires rolling smoothly over pavement that looked ordinary again, as if nothing had ever interrupted its routine, streetlights flickering back to their normal rhythm, distant traffic signals restoring their patterns, the city resuming its pulse without acknowledgement of what had just been rewritten within it. Lyra leaned back slightly in her seat, her gaze still on him, her thoughts no longer racing, but settling into something deeper, more deliberate, because she understood now that the most significant part of what had happened was not the system's retreat, not the directive's revision, but the choice that had forced it. "Ethan," she said, his name no longer a formality, but a recognition, and he glanced at her briefly, attentive, but not expectant. "You changed their directive," she continued, and there was no accusation in it, only observation, and perhaps a hint of something else, something closer to understanding. Ethan considered the words for a moment, then gave a slight shake of his head, eyes returning to the road ahead as the city lights stretched into familiar patterns once more. "No," he said quietly, "they changed it, and that distinction mattered, because it meant the system had not been broken. It had been convinced, and Lyra felt that settle into her understanding with a weight that would not fade easily, because it implied something far greater than control, something far more difficult to achieve. "Because of you," she said, and this time he did not answer immediately, his hands steady on the wheel, his focus on the road. But there was a subtle shift in his expression, not visible in any obvious way, but present in the space between his breaths. "Because I chose," he replied at last, and the words carried a quiet truth that echoed beyond the moment, beyond the vehicle, beyond the system that had just withdrawn, because they defined something fundamental, something that could not be assigned, programmed, or erased. The car continued forward, merging seamlessly back into the flow of the city, another vehicle among thousands, unnoticed, unremarkable, and yet inside it, something had changed that the galaxy itself might never fully understand. Lyra turned her gaze forward, watching the road stretch out ahead, illuminated by steady beams of light, and for the first time since this began, she did not feel the need to question what had happened. She simply accepted it, not as an anomaly, but as a truth she had witnessed firsthand, and beside her, Ethan drove on in silence, not as a weapon, not as a subject, but as something far simpler and far more complex at the same time. And as the rain softened and the city returned to its rhythm, the only trace of what had occurred remained in a single, unspoken realization that lingered between them, quiet and undeniable, that in a universe built on directives